The sound of children's laughter once filled the streets of this affluent black neighborhood in Dallas, Texas. It was a community where families thrived, where trust and security seemed like unshakable pillars. Parents walked their children to school, exchanged pleasantries over the fence, and relied on one another to ensure their homes remained safe and welcoming. But behind the manicured lawns and sparkling windows, a hidden darkness began to grow, one that would forever change the community's sense of peace. In 2021, a series of tragic, mysterious deaths took place, each one tied to a familiar face in the neighborhood. Each family had entrusted the care of their children to the same babysitting agency, operated by a woman who appeared to be the epitome of trustworthiness. Tamika Ellis, a single mother and seemingly devoted caretaker, had built a solid reputation as the reliable go-to for local families seeking a trustworthy babysitter. But behind her warm smile and compassionate demeanor, Tamika harbored a monstrous secret, one that would shake the foundation of everything the community thought they knew about her. The deaths, initially seen as random and isolated, soon began to reveal a chilling pattern. There was one common thread that connected each victim. They had all been under Tamika's care when they died. As police began to dig deeper, they uncovered a terrifying reality. Hidden cameras, forged identities, and a scheme motivated not by financial gain, but by something much darker: revenge. The tragic deaths were not accidents. They were the result of a carefully planned and executed series of murders. The community had been living a lie. The woman they trusted with their children, the woman they welcomed into their homes, was hiding a truth so horrifying it could never have been imagined. What began as a quiet tragedy quickly spiraled into a nightmarish revelation. A seemingly harmless babysitter had become the most sinister figure in the neighborhood's history. Dallas, Texas, is a city where affluence and charm intermingle. The neighborhood at the heart of this tragedy is an upscale, predominantly black suburb, known for its tree-lined streets and well-maintained homes. It's the kind of place where neighbors know each other's names, where children play in front yards without worry, and where families trust local services to care for their most precious possessions, their children. In a community that prides itself on being tight-knit and self-sustaining, there is little room for suspicion. When Tamika Ellis launched her babysitting agency, it quickly became a staple in the neighborhood. As a single mother, Tamika positioned herself as not only a reliable caretaker, but also a role model for others in the community. She offered her services with a personal touch, carefully matching her caregivers with families based on individual needs and preferences. Her reputation for trustworthiness spread quickly, making her a sought-after babysitter for families in the area. For years, parents in this close-knit neighborhood entrusted their children to Tamika's agency without hesitation, confident that they were in safe hands. The agency flourished, and Tamika became a well-known figure, often referred to as the go-to person for childcare. Her ability to provide peace of mind to working parents, who often struggled to find trustworthy care for their children, cemented her place as a respected and reliable figure in the community. But as a series of tragic deaths unfolded, the image of Tamika as a trustworthy, selfless caregiver began to crumble. behind her carefully cultivated persona, something much darker simmered, hidden from the prying eyes of a trusting public. As more families were affected and the community began to turn its attention toward the agency, the truth became undeniable. The once praised business and its owner were now under intense scrutiny, and the secrets Tamika had been hiding were poised to emerge. As we dive deeper into this chilling investigation, we invite you to subscribe to Beyond the Evidence, where we explore the hidden stories behind the headlines. We take a closer look at the details, uncovering the truths that often remain hidden. If you want to know more about this case and others like it, make sure you hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. Tamika Ellis had earned the kind of trust that many only dream of in their professional lives. In a community where parents balanced the demands of careers and family life, her babysitting agency became the foundation of their peace of mind. She wasn't just another businesswoman. She was a member of the community, a familiar face. Her presence was synonymous with reliability and warmth. For many families in this affluent Dallas neighborhood, hiring Tamika's agency was more than a service. It was an extension of the family itself. Tamika was a single mother, and her story resonated with many. She portrayed herself as a woman who understood the struggles of working parents, juggling responsibilities while raising children. Her story was one of resilience. She had built her agency from the ground up, determined to offer care that reflected her own values of love, respect, and trust. She made it a point to personally connect with every family that hired her, making each parent feel like they were not just another client, but a part of her extended family. This was more than a business transaction. It was about creating an emotional bond that made parents feel comfortable with leaving their children in her care. As the agency grew, so did her reputation. Tamika's charm was undeniable. She had a way of making people feel seen and valued, often offering comforting words and advice. She had an eye for the little details, whether it was remembering a child's favorite snack or noting the smallest preferences that made parents feel that their children were being cared for in the best possible way. Parents described her as thoughtful, attentive, and always eager to go the extra mile. Her dedication to the children she watched over seemed beyond reproach. Tamika's influence extended beyond her role as a caretaker. She was trusted by the community at large, becoming involved in local events, volunteering at schools, and offering advice to other parents. Her reputation spread, and it wasn't long before she became a central figure in the neighborhood's social fabric. Families began to rely on her not just for childcare, but for guidance and support in their personal lives. This was a woman who was seen as not only a caregiver, but also a confidant. Yet, as Tamika's relationship with the community grew, so did the sense of power she held over the families who trusted her. Parents would routinely speak about the special bond they shared with her, and how she understood their struggles better than anyone else. It was a subtle manipulation, a way to ensure that her position was never questioned. She made herself indispensable in the lives of the families she served, a reassuring figure in an otherwise busy world. As time passed, however, the nature of her relationships with her clients began to shift. The bond Tamika had so carefully crafted began to mask something far more insidious. She had a hidden agenda, one that had been brewing under the surface for years. There were whispers, small, barely noticeable moments when her temper flared or when her words seemed slightly too pointed, as if she was harboring resentments against the family she worked for. But these moments were fleeting, easily dismissed by the parents who adored her. Tamika had a past, one that she worked hard to conceal. As the investigation into the deaths unfolded, police began to uncover elements of her history that had been carefully hidden. It became clear that Tamika had been hiding a personal vendetta, and her charm was simply a tool to manipulate the very people who thought they knew her. The relationships she had cultivated over the years were not based on genuine care, but on something darker. She had used her influence, her power, and her position to fuel her own desires. She wasn't just the trusted babysitter. She had become a puppet master, pulling strings in the lives of families who had no idea that their trust in her was about to be shattered in the worst way possible. What was once seen as a nurturing, maternal relationship now revealed itself to be a carefully orchestrated manipulation. As the police began to connect the dots, they uncovered a web of deceit that had been spun over years. Tamika's influence wasn't just about the care she provided. It was about control, about revenge, about something far more sinister that had been brewing for far too long. The complexity of these relationships, once built on trust, now lay exposed as a house of cards, ready to collapse. It was not just the children who had been placed in harm's way. The families who had come to rely on Tamika were now left to question everything they thought they knew about her, and about the woman they had trusted with their children's lives. The first signs of something terribly wrong began to surface quietly, almost unnoticed. It was the kind of thing that most parents would dismiss as an unfortunate accident, a one-time tragedy that could never be predicted or prevented. But when the death of a child under Tamika Ellis's care occurred, the community was thrown into confusion, grief, and disbelief. No one expected the string of events that would follow, as what appeared to be a tragic accident soon spiraled into something far darker. It started with the sudden, unexplained death of a toddler, a child who had been in Tamika's care for only a few days. At first, there were no obvious signs of foul play, no bruises, no marks, no immediate cause of death that stood out. The parents, devastated but trusting, assumed it was a tragic accident. Yet, something about the whole situation felt off. The child's sudden passing left too many questions unanswered, but no one dared to voice those doubts, especially not when Tamika was so convincing in her grief. The calm, collected woman who had been a constant figure in their lives seemed just as shattered as any parent would be in such circumstances. She reassured everyone that it was an unfortunate tragedy, one of those things that couldn't be foreseen or prevented. But the sense of unease lingered. Tamika's calmness in the face of such loss seemed almost too rehearsed, too composed. Parents began to talk quietly among themselves, sharing their concerns. It was only when another child, just a few months later, died in the same manner under Tamika's watch that the small cracks in the narrative began to widen. This second death was not just a repeat of the first. It was eerily similar in its timing, the circumstances, and the lack of clear explanation. The whispers started to spread more rapidly now, though still hesitant, still wrapped in disbelief. At first, no one could believe that there was any connection between the two deaths. After all, Tamika had always been so reliable, so trustworthy. How could someone like her, someone who had been welcomed into so many homes, someone who had been so deeply trusted with children's lives, be capable of causing harm? But the second death was the spark that ignited the fire of suspicion. Parents who had hired her began to question whether something more sinister was at play. It was then that the first warning signs became impossible to ignore. Parents began to notice small, unsettling details about Tamika's behavior. Her responses to the deaths were increasingly distant, almost detached. When one parent asked if there was anything unusual during the time the child was in her care, Tamika's answers were vague and lacking in detail. There were no clear explanations for the incidents, and there was an unsettling absence of empathy in her demeanor. For the first time, cracks began to form in the carefully constructed facade she had built over the years. Tamika was no longer the woman they had trusted. She was someone else entirely, someone who seemed to hide something far darker beneath her polished exterior. Suspicion grew, but it was still tempered by a reluctance to believe the worst about someone who had been a trusted figure in the community. Parents who had known Tamika for years had a difficult time reconciling the woman they thought they knew with the possibility that she could be involved in something so heinous. They had never seen the signs before. She had always been the one they turned to, the one they relied on for their most precious loved ones. Now those very same parents had to come to terms with a terrifying new reality. What they had thought was a tragic accident could be something far worse. The community, still grieving, hesitated to act. There was no concrete evidence to link Tamika directly to the deaths. The deaths were all seemingly accidents, with no signs of foul play. But as more families started to question the truth, they began to wonder, was this truly the work of chance? Or was something more deliberate taking place? What began as subtle suspicions soon turned into a quiet realization that they had trusted a woman who was hiding something monstrous behind her warm, compassionate exterior. The tipping point came when a third child died under Tamika Ellis's care. This time, the circumstances were too eerily similar to the previous deaths to ignore any longer. Once again, the child had been under Tamika's supervision for only a short period, and once again, there were no clear signs of a medical explanation. The family, still reeling from the first two tragedies, could not deny the growing sense of dread that had gripped them. What was once a whisper of suspicion had now escalated into an undeniable truth. Something was terribly wrong. As the deaths mounted, so too did the pressure for answers. The community, which had once placed so much trust in Tamika, began to fracture under the weight of the mystery. Some parents, desperate for answers, began to investigate on their own. It wasn't long before the police became involved, prompted by the mounting pressure from those who had started to connect the dots. Authorities, who initially had no reason to suspect foul play, now began to see patterns that were too consistent to be coincidence. The similarities between the deaths, timing, circumstances, and Tamika's role as a caregiver could no longer be dismissed. In an effort to get to the bottom of the mystery, law enforcement obtained a search warrant for Tamika's home and agency. What they discovered sent shockwaves through the community and revealed the sinister truth that no one could have imagined. Hidden cameras, carefully installed by Tamika herself, were found in several locations around her home, including in the rooms where the children had been cared for. The discovery of these cameras suggested something far more disturbing than negligence or accident. It pointed to deliberate surveillance of the children under her care. This was no longer a case of simple carelessness. It was a calculated, premeditated act. The investigation didn't stop there. As authorities dug deeper into Tamika's background, they uncovered something even more unsettling: forged identities. It turned out that Tamika had been using fake names and altered documents in order to present herself as a trusted caregiver. The children she had been looking after were not the only victims of her deception. Tamika had created an entire web of falsehoods to cover her tracks, all while maintaining the facade of the perfect caregiver. Each forged identity served a specific purpose, allowing her to hide behind layers of deception and gain the trust of unsuspecting families. But it was the motive behind these crimes that was the most chilling of all. Tamika wasn't simply acting out of greed or a desire for financial gain. No, the shocking truth was that Tamika's actions were driven by something far more personal: revenge. Her target wasn't just any random family. Tamika had a specific vendetta against certain members of the community. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Tamika had carefully chosen her victims, selecting families she held deep-seated grudges against. The deaths of their children were not accidental or random. They were a calculated attempt to exact revenge for past grievances that had been festering for years, unknown to the very families Tamika had once charmed and befriended. The horror of Tamika's motive sent ripples through the community. Parents were left to grapple with the unimaginable reality that their trust had been used against them in the most horrific way possible. The woman they had entrusted with their children's lives, the woman they had relied on for care and comfort, had been driven by an insidious desire for retribution. No one had seen it coming, not the families, not the community, and certainly not the authorities. As Tamika's true nature was revealed, the shockwaves continued to reverberate. The question on everyone's mind was the same: how had this gone unnoticed for so long? The tight-knit nature of the community, the trust that had been built over years, seemed to have blinded everyone to the dark reality lurking just beneath the surface. Tamika's charm, her warmth, and her ability to gain the trust of others had allowed her to carry out her crimes without suspicion for far too long. With the hidden cameras, the forged identities, and the shocking revelation of her personal vendetta, Tamika's web of lies unraveled quickly. The investigation painted a picture of a woman who had been hiding in plain sight, manipulating everyone around her to serve her own twisted agenda. The deaths of these innocent children were not the result of an unthinkable accident. They were the product of cold, calculated malice, carried out by a woman who had long ago traded her humanity for vengeance. As the truth came to light, Tamika's carefully constructed life began to collapse. The investigation revealed the full extent of her crimes, and with each new detail, the community was forced to confront the horrifying reality that their trust had been shattered in the most unimaginable way. The revelations of Tamika Ellis's crimes sent shockwaves through the community, leaving parents and residents grappling with feelings of disbelief, betrayal, and profound grief. What had once been a quiet, affluent neighborhood was now a place where trust had been obliterated, where families were left to mourn not only the loss of their children, but also the loss of the safety and security they had long taken for granted. In the wake of the investigation, parents were faced with an unbearable realization. How could they have missed the signs? How could someone they had trusted with their children, someone they had welcomed into their homes, commit such horrific acts? The emotional toll on the parents was immeasurable. Not only were they forced to process the shock of their children's untimely deaths, but they also had to come to terms with the horrifying truth that the woman they had trusted to care for them had been the orchestrator of their suffering. The community's collective grief was compounded by a sense of betrayal. Tamika had not just been a babysitter. She had been a figure of trust, a confidant to many, and even a friend. Her calculated actions now left a scar so deep that it would be difficult, if not impossible, for the families to recover from. The parents of the victims, in particular, felt the weight of this double betrayal. First, the loss of their children, and second, the realization that they had been duped by someone they had allowed into their lives with open arms. For many, the immediate aftermath was filled with questions. Why did Tamika target them? What had they done to deserve such cruelty? The parents who had lost children could not shake the deep sense of guilt that now lingered. Were there warning signs they had missed? Were there clues they had failed to see in their interactions with Tamika? Many began to second-guess every decision they had made, wondering if they could have prevented the deaths of their loved ones. For the surviving families, the trauma was just as intense. Even though their children had survived their time with Tamika, the emotional damage was profound. The parents who had unknowingly put their children in harm's way were left questioning everything they thought they knew about the woman they had trusted. They struggled with overwhelming feelings of guilt and shame for having allowed their children to be placed in such a dangerous situation. Some even questioned their ability to trust again, wondering if anyone in the world could be trusted after such a betrayal. Community meetings were held, but the discussions were often disjointed, filled with tears and expressions of disbelief. In every conversation, the same theme emerged. How had this happened? The investigation into Tamika's past revealed that she had carefully cultivated relationships with her clients over years, manipulating them with her charm and warmth until they were convinced she was above reproach. In doing so, she had shielded herself from any real suspicion, creating a web of deceit that extended far beyond the individual families. For many, the aftermath was not only about the crimes themselves, but also about the impact of the betrayal on the very fabric of the community. The trust that had once defined the relationships between neighbors had now been shattered, leaving a void that would be difficult to fill. Families who had once supported each other through common bonds now found themselves divided, some unwilling to forgive, others desperately trying to rebuild the shattered sense of security they had once enjoyed. As the investigation continued and more information came to light, the emotional toll on the community continued to mount. The trauma was not just personal, it was collective. The families were not only grieving their losses, but also trying to piece together the fragments of a life that had been forever altered by the actions of one woman. The emotional scars were deep, and the healing process seemed insurmountable. Parents wondered if they would ever feel safe again in their own neighborhood, or if the shadow of Tamika's betrayal would forever linger over their lives. The psychological impact on the children who had been in Tamika's care was also significant. Some had witnessed things they would never forget, while others struggled with the understanding that the woman they had once trusted had harmed them in ways they could not yet comprehend. The community now faced the difficult task of providing support for these children, helping them navigate the emotional fallout of being exploited by someone they had once trusted. As the shock waves from Tamika Ellis's crimes reverberated through the community, the investigation into her actions intensified. What had started as a string of unexplained deaths had now escalated into a full-blown criminal case, with law enforcement uncovering more layers of deception with each passing day. The families who had once trusted Tamika were now desperate for answers, as the truth about the woman they had welcomed into their homes began to surface. The first major breakthrough came when police uncovered a series of hidden cameras installed by Tamika herself in several areas of her home, including the rooms where the children had been placed under her care. This discovery, which sent a shiver through everyone involved, immediately raised the stakes. The cameras were not merely for surveillance. They were evidence of a chilling and deliberate plan. Tamika had not been simply neglectful. She had been watching the children as part of a calculated scheme. These hidden recordings, which were discovered later during the investigation, became a crucial piece of the puzzle, revealing more about her actions and motivations. As the investigators examined the footage from these hidden cameras, a disturbing picture began to form. The recordings were shockingly revealing, not only documenting Tamika's interactions with the children, but also exposing her complete disregard for their well-being. The authorities uncovered disturbing patterns in the way she interacted with the children, patterns that strongly suggested she was intentionally putting them at risk. But even more shocking was the discovery of certain moments where the children seemed to be manipulated or coerced into specific behaviors that seemed to serve Tamika's mysterious agenda. This revelation, coupled with the ongoing investigation into her background, soon led authorities to discover something even more sinister: forged identities. It turned out that Tamika had been using fake names, manipulated documentation, and altered records to present herself as a reliable and trustworthy caregiver. Each false identity had served a specific purpose, allowing her to infiltrate the lives of families and gain their trust. What was even more troubling was the realization that Tamika had spent years weaving this web of lies, not only to protect her own actions, but to gain access to families in the community. As the investigation unfolded, it became apparent that Tamika had been orchestrating her crimes with incredible precision. The true horror of her motives soon came to light. It wasn't just about the money or the control. Tamika's actions were driven by something far more personal. Her involvement in the deaths of the children was revealed to be part of a calculated revenge plot. Tamika had targeted specific families, each one selected based on personal grievances that had festered over time. These were not random acts of violence. They were the product of a deep-seated resentment, a desire for retribution that had been building in Tamika for years. In her mind, the children's deaths were not just collateral damage. They were a deliberate act of vengeance against the families she had chosen to punish. The specifics of her grievances remained unclear to the public for a time, but as the investigation progressed, more was uncovered about the motives that had driven her to such extremes. Some of the families she targeted had unknowingly wronged her in the past, whether through personal disagreements or other unresolved issues. To Tamika, these families had wronged her in ways that demanded a brutal reckoning. With each new revelation, the community's sense of disbelief deepened. How had this woman, so trusted by so many, been hiding such a twisted agenda behind a veil of kindness and compassion? The answer, it seemed, was a combination of charm, manipulation, and calculated deception. Tamika had crafted her persona so carefully that no one could see the darkness beneath the surface. Her ability to manipulate and control those around her had allowed her to carry out her plan with frightening effectiveness, while maintaining the facade of a trustworthy caregiver. For the families who had trusted her with their children, the full scope of Tamika's betrayal was almost too much to bear. Not only had she taken their children's lives, but she had done so with premeditation, carefully crafting her actions for the sole purpose of revenge. It was a truth too horrific to comprehend, and yet it was the grim reality they had to face. The police now had the evidence they needed to press charges, and the community had to come to terms with the fact that the woman they had all relied on for so long was, in fact, a cold-blooded killer. The investigation had finally brought the truth to light, but the damage had already been done. The families were left with a haunting realization that their trust in Tamika had been their undoing. And, as they began to process the revelations, the community faced the sobering reality that there was no way to undo the harm that had been done. The conclusion of the investigation marked the beginning of a painful new chapter for the community. Tamika Ellis was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, child abuse, and fraud. As the legal proceedings unfolded, the weight of her crimes became undeniably clear. The once cherished babysitter was now seen as one of the most disturbing figures in the neighborhood's history. For the families affected by her actions, there was no sense of closure, only the harsh realization that their trust had been betrayed in the most horrific way imaginable. In the courtroom, the details of her calculated crimes were laid bare for the public. The hidden cameras, the forged identities, the meticulous planning behind the deaths of innocent children. It all painted a portrait of a woman who had masked her true nature with charm and warmth. Tamika's manipulations had been so effective that even after the truth emerged, some struggled to comprehend how they had been deceived for so long. Her trial was not just a legal battle. It became a reflection of the deep psychological and emotional toll her actions had taken on the community. For the families who had lost children, the legal process felt like another blow. Their grief was compounded by the constant reminders of the brutal betrayal they had endured. In some ways, the trial felt like an endless cycle of pain, as they were forced to relive the tragedy over and over again. The question of justice was complicated by the knowledge that no legal consequence could ever truly right the wrong that had been done. Even with the conviction of Tamika Ellis, the families would never be able to heal fully from the loss of their loved ones, nor would they ever regain the sense of security they once had. As Tamika was sentenced to life in prison, the community was left to rebuild. The emotional scars of her actions ran deep, and many struggled with a lingering sense of unease. Could they ever trust again? Could they ever feel safe knowing that a woman they had invited into their homes had hidden such monstrous intentions? The path to healing was uncertain, with some families unable to forgive and others struggling to rebuild relationships that had been fractured by betrayal. Yet, amidst the devastation, there was a call for reflection. How had a person so deeply trusted been able to mask their true intentions for so long? What lessons could be learned from this tragedy? For many, the journey toward healing was also a journey of introspection, of learning to recognize the signs of manipulation and deceit in their own lives, and of becoming more cautious in the relationships they built. As we reflect on this case, we also invite you, our viewers, to share your thoughts. How do we rebuild trust after such a betrayal? What steps can communities take to ensure that something like this never happens again? Leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe to Beyond the Evidence for more in-depth investigations into cases like this one.